Good morning.
Morning.
Blessing of the Lord be upon you.
Bless the name of the Lord.
Mark chapter 5, we will start off with verses 22 through 28. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and to live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Remember that, 12 years. And who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, If I touch even his garment, I will be made well. Where's God when we hurt? It shouldn't surprise us that he is very close at all times. The problem isn't that God absents himself when our adversity comes our way. The truth is, God is never closer to us than when we need him. He's there. The problem is our own lack of trust in what God can do to overcome our problems. The answers aren't always the answers that we want or the answers that we expect. God gives the answers that are best for us. Now in Mark chapter 5, verses 22 through 28, Jesus encounters two people whose lives are immersed in tragedy, or from the title that we had up there a moment ago, crisis. Crisis. And we know when a crisis comes, we want results. We want things to happen and these crises to be resolved quickly. In the passage that we just read, there are three persons of faith we want to watch carefully. Watch them carefully, examine them. Number one, Jairus, the synagogue official. He was no doubt a man of influence in his community. Now, an official in a synagogue was like an elder in the church today. And I'm not talking denomination-wise, but like an elder in the church. And if we really went back to the early days of the church, we'd see that as a community, this would be a person who was respected in the community too. Jairus came to Jesus out of desperation for his 12-year-old daughter. Remember how long the lady had this issue of blood? 12 years. And so that's a common bond that's in there that we might sometimes miss. She was so ill that she didn't think she would be alive when he returned, when he came back from the dead. Okay? The man was faced with, the daughter was so ill that he didn't think she would be alive when he returned. Okay? That's how close to death she was, but he wanted Jesus to get there. So he faced this crisis at home. It was out of his hands. No earthly possession that he had could change her fate. Couldn't run to a doctor, couldn't take her to a hospital, couldn't get her to the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or anywhere. I mean, it's just, it's up to God. It's up to the Lord. So seemingly out of nowhere, we're introduced to an unnamed woman. She'd spent nearly all of her money on doctors and medications. No help for her. Her illness had lasted, again, the lifetime of Jairus' daughter. She had an incurable hemorrhage that was wasting away her body. That's what happens. You have bleeding, nutrition fails, it just continually down and down. So, moreover, according to Jewish law, she was ceremonially unclean. She couldn't go to the synagogue. She couldn't really be around people. If anybody came close to her, touched her, They were considered unclean, so nobody wanted to be unclean. They wouldn't be around her. So here she is. She's got this problem. Jesus is in town. He's going to go with Jairus to heal his daughter, or at least look at her to see what's going on. So she slips silently through the crowd. She's got a plan. She's just trying to get close enough to Jesus that she believes that she can just touch the hem of his garment. And sometimes we see that in songs, right? If she could just touch the hem of his garment, she would be healed. Now that's the second person of faith that we have. We've got a third person of faith, and that, of course, is Jesus. Jesus. Both Jairus and the woman needed the urgent attention of Jesus, who is the ultimate person of faith. Remember, he's still a human being, okay? He's God who became a human being, but he's still a human being, and he's got to live by faith also. Live by faith knowing what his experience on earth is going to be. What's going to end with him, or end up being his fate, which, of course, it's a cross, but it's also the resurrection. That he's got to trust that all of that is going to come to fruition. So we can see these three persons of faith there, and how that we can see that, faith is in crisis here. It's in crisis for Jairus. It's in crisis for this woman. Jesus is the answer to their problem, their crisis of faith. Both Jairus and the woman made a plea of faith to Jesus. Okay? And that's what we want to examine here. Mark chapter 5, verse 22 and 23, and we've already gone over this, but again, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, fell at his feet. Now, if he was a ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus had been in this city before, there was probably a little bit of enmity between Jesus and this ruler of the synagogue. He probably didn't like Jesus. He probably didn't want Jesus teaching that the Jewish religion needed to be changed, that they weren't really doing what they needed to do. They really hadn't been worshiping God with a full heart, that something was missing. There was constant, in some of the synagogues, they would actually take Jesus out and try to stone him to death. Some of them would try to have him arrested and thrown into prison. This man had to eat a lot of pride in order to come to Jesus. But he did know that Jesus could do something. He did know that Jesus could work miracles. He did know that Jesus healed people. And this is like a last resort. In this crisis, I've got no one else I can go to. I may as well try Jesus. I'm a man standing in the community. I'm a religious person. Maybe Jesus can help. So seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." But see, now he's got confidence. Before it might have been, well, he's doing this by the devil, right? He casts out demons by Beelzebub, is what many of the critics would say. But now he's got confidence, and he speaks in a language of assurance. You come, you lay hands on her, and she'll be made well, she'll live. Because it's his last resort. Faith is growing, so to speak. But it's a bold, loud, demonstrable plea that he's making. Everybody, there's crowds around Jesus, and he works his way there, and it's loud. Everybody can hear it. Hey, the ruler of the synagogue is coming to Jesus. He's asking Jesus to do something. What effect do you think that had on the rest of the crowd? somebody who apparently was an enemy before, now asking Jesus for a favor. We don't know when he first encountered Jesus. Again, maybe Jesus had spoken in that synagogue, but whatever hostility there may have been before, now because of faith, it's gone, and this man of faith coming to Jesus and humbly making his plea for help shows a change, very strong change in attitude. But the point I want to make here, it's bold, it's loud, it's demonstrable. Out in the open, everybody can see it. The woman's plea is equally bold. It had to be, right? But it's private and it's silent. Mark 5:27-28. Talking about this woman. She had heard the reports about Jesus. She couldn't go to the synagogue, right? See him maybe heal somebody in the synagogue. She couldn't be around people seeing him maybe give sight to the blind or take a lame person and make them be able to walk. But she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. See, that was her interpretation of the faith. Her faith. So she unintentionally interrupted Jesus. Jairus intentionally interrupted Jesus. Bold, loud. Her, yes, it's bold, but she didn't want to make a big scene. She just wanted to silently move in there. Last thing she wanted to do was draw attention to herself. What would happen? Hey, look, there's that woman. She's got bleeding going on. Don't touch her, you'll get unclean. Right? Could have caused a riot. Just touch his garments, be healed, and then what? Kind of slip away unnoticed. That's the kind of faith she had. Problem, right? Big problem. Jesus knew something wonderful had just occurred, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. And now we talk about the power of faith working in a person's life. Cannot be hidden. The power of faith working in a person's life cannot be hidden. It's going to show up somewhere, somehow, some way. It's going to be exposed. That's why we say someone who is a child of God, you're going to know it. You're going to know it. Mark chapter 5, verses 29-34. Excuse me. She touches the hem of Jesus' garment, okay? And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Now that took some courage, didn't it? Verse 34, and he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. There are many people touching Jesus. That's what the disciple says. There are many people pressing in here. There are a lot of people coming up and touching you, and you're asking who touched you? It's like, take your pick. They're all here. But only one came with faith in Jesus' touch. Well, what was it? Hey, there were probably a lot of people that wanted to go pat Jesus on the back, shake his hand, whatever. Hey, remember me when you come. Probably a lot of them were following Jesus so they could see a miracle, right? One came to be part of the miracle. And that was this woman. She wanted to be part of the miracle. She had faith. Now, I'm not saying that there are miracles today. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying in that context, she wanted something that the crowd didn't. Jairus wanted something that the crowd didn't want. That's why he was so different from the crowd. She was different from the crowd. And that's what faith was doing for them. Jairus, see, that was a different story. During the woman's interruption, worse news arrived from his home, didn't it? Verse 35, Mark 5. While he, Jesus, was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" They concluded that her death ended all hope. Don't trouble Jesus, she's dead. Nothing more can be done. What does that mean? Well, there were a large group of people back then that believed that death was the end of it all. That if a person died before Jesus, or before the Messiah came, and before the Messiah was exposed or shown to be Messiah and set up his kingdom, that there was no hope. And I think that's the case in 1 Thessalonians. You know, what happens to the people, even people in the church who die before the Lord comes back, see? And Paul has to explain to them. He'll bring them back with him. He'll bring the spirits back with him. But that was their belief. You know, death is the end of it all. Then we got a signpost, right? Signpost, verse 36. But what I tell you about signposts, when you see one of those signposts, but, therefore, since, conclusion, change taking place here. But, overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Do not fear, have faith. The opposite of faith is fear. If we fear something, we're not having faith. Remember what fear is? False evidence appearing real. Do not fear, only believe. Everybody at Jairus' house said the daughter was dead. You know what Jesus said? She's only sleeping. You know what they did? They laughed at him. They laughed at him. Mark chapter 5, verse 40 and 42, or through 42. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha Kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. She was as old as what the woman was, or what the woman had the disease, for how long the woman had the disease, the hemorrhage, right? And they were immediately overcome with amazement. She's been sick, she had a fever, whatever, she died, and now she's up and walking. Immediately. That's a miracle. That's what a miracle is. It defies natural explanation. But you notice those differences in faith. You notice the results. Jesus was able to do something. And through all that, again, we need to understand that those physical things, material things that Jesus was able to accomplish is to show us what he can do for us spiritually. That's the big deal that we look at. But several lessons we should learn from this encounter with Jesus. Number one, life is full of interruptions which can lead to faith-building events. We should welcome them. Do you ever get upset when somebody interrupts you? I do. I shouldn't, but I do. We should welcome them because they can be faith-building events. It wasn't the case with Jesus. He was interrupted twice. Both times he was able to do what? Help somebody because of their faith to be able to have a stronger faith. Secondly, Jesus gave himself to souls in need, whether rulers or outcasts. See the difference? See a ruler of the synagogue, and here's a woman that couldn't go to the synagogue. He helped both. Well, I'll help him because, boy, he's the ruler of the synagogue, but hers, she's nobody. Jesus helped both. Number three, don't argue with unbelievers. Just sow the seed and let it change people's lives. That's what we're supposed to do, sow the seed. Yeah, we help people. Some people you can't help. But you sow a seed. And maybe somebody come along and water it. You never know. But don't argue with them. Look, I can't help. I can't argue with what you believe. Right? If you believe something, I can't argue with what you believe. He said, well, I believe X. Well, I can't say, well, I can't argue with what you believe. Now, I can argue about what the Bible says, but I can't argue with what you believe. You want to talk about what the Bible says? That's a different story, right? So don't argue. Sow the seed. And it'll grow. Number four, focus your faith on Christ. Don't get distracted by the world or the worldly. She's dead. Don't bother the master. I don't know. You know, in our lives, someone we love dies, that's when we need to go to the master. We need to be closer to him at those times. Number five, the living Christ transforms our understanding of death. Have you ever seen that song, Because He Lives, I Can Face Tomorrow? Yeah, that's a beautiful song. Because He lives, I can face anything, any challenge that comes up. It may be difficult, but He lives. Because He's faced it all. He's gotten through it all, and He says He'll be there to help me get through it all. And number six, don't wait until the time of a crisis to turn to God. When should Jairus have come to Jesus? Before? When should this woman have come to Jesus? Well, before. It's 12 years, and he's been ministering for, if it's in the middle of his ministry, about a year and a half to 2 years. She had time. But, we don't know. But it doesn't matter. Get there as soon as you can. Get to Jesus as soon as you can. John chapter 5. And this is where it should hit us, because, listen, we're not talking about material, physical things. Let's get it in the spiritual realm. In John chapter 5, verse 25 through 27, Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and is now here, when the dead," and he's talking about the spiritually dead here, "will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear," which means believe and obey, "will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he's granted to the Son also to have life in himself, and he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man." But what Jesus is talking about there is that he came to this earth to take all who are spiritually dead, give them the opportunity to believe and obey so that they can live spiritually here upon this earth and die in a condition spiritually to where they can have eternal life. Revelation chapter 20 verse 6, blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. Okay? That's talking about that first resurrection. What's that first resurrection? I submit to you, and we'll look at a passage here in a moment, that is when we believe and obey the gospel, when we are buried with him in baptism, raised or resurrected to walk in newness of life. That's the first resurrection. And when we are part of that and continue faithful unto death, then the second death, which is eternal death, has no power over us. We'll reign with him for 1,000 years. I think I mentioned in the sermon last week, or maybe in Bible class. Remember, that's collectively. That's the church in its existence for that figurative 1,000 years. That's the church age, from the day of Pentecost till when Christ returns again. But here's the proof of the pudding. Mark 16, verses 15 and 16. And Jesus said to them, to the apostles, go to all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. And there's your answer to that first resurrection and the second death having no power over those who have part in that first resurrection. So that tells us what we need to do. And that tells us about our crisis of faith, right? What do we need to do to be saved from that second death, eternal death? He gives us the answer. Well, my time ran out a long time ago, but I continued on. I struggled right through that. I've got to be healed. Thank you so much for your time, for your attention. If you have any, please let your request be made known as we stand and sing the invitation song.